Hello everyone! In this lesson we will answer the question, what does the phrase mobile first mean? Throughout this lesson, here's what we will cover. So first, I want to explain how the phrase mobile first can mean different things when it's used in different contexts. After that, I want to talk about how we can apply the mobile first philosophy to our travel website. And finally, you and I will work together to begin writing CSS the mobile first way. Alright, so let's begin up at the top and ask the question, what does the phrase mobile first even mean? We can answer that with a few other questions, namely, what is responsive web design? And what are the shortcomings with traditional responsive web design? Here's what I mean by that. Let's imagine a responsive website. So the layout and content of this hypothetical page are optimized for the size of the device that is viewing it. So maybe the page uses a 3-column layout on a laptop or desktop. Maybe it uses a 2-column layout on a tablet. And maybe things collapse to a single-column layout on a smartphone. Now, when responsive web design first began, we would build the desktop or the most advanced view of the site first, and then adapt the layout to fit smaller and smaller screens as necessary. So we moved in this direction. We built in this direction. Eventually, two big factors made the web design community reverse this and begin building in the opposite direction. So what were those two factors? Why did we decide that this was a good idea? Why is mobile first important? Well, factor number one was that we had recently just witnessed a change, or not even a change, a revolution in the way that people use the internet. So now significantly more traffic comes from mobile devices than traditional desktops or laptops. And your primary source of traffic should not be an afterthought. You should design and build with it in mind from the beginning. Factor number two is that we eventually realized that traditional desktop-first responsive design resulted in bloated, slow-loading websites. Because even though we used CSS to adapt and optimize the layout for different devices, we were still forcing tiny smartphones to download huge image files that were intended for desktop monitors. So for example, we might have had a large image that was 400 kilobytes, and it was large enough to look good on a 27-inch desktop monitor. But sending that image to a smartphone user is a huge waste of their data plan, because a way smaller image that weighs only 30 or 40 kilobytes still would have looked crisp and sharp on the smaller smartphone screen. And it also would have loaded way faster. Now that's just one example. The key concept behind factor number two is that we don't want anyone to have to download extra data that they won't even use. We want to build efficient websites that load as quickly as possible for everyone. And it just so happens that beginning with the most advanced view of our site as the baseline and trying to strip it down is not the best way of doing things. It no longer made sense, and browser technology had advanced to the point where we could easily do better, which is obviously where mobile first comes into play. The idea behind mobile first is that we begin with the most essential view of our site, and we progressively enhance the layout and the assets only when necessary for larger and more advanced devices. Alright, so at this point, we have a general idea of what mobile first is referring to. Now, let's talk about the different contexts that the phrase can be used in. So there's the design context and the development context. So when we think of mobile first design, this refers to actually designing around a smaller screen first. This can be a good idea because smaller screens force us to really prioritize what we want to showcase. People also have a shorter attention span when using a mobile device, so this will force us to try and anticipate the most common actions that our visitors will want to take and place those front and center in our design. So when we think of who is involved in mobile first design, it's the information architects, it's the graphic designers, and it's the usability experts. When we hear about mobile first development, this refers to coding the site in such a way that devices won't download unnecessary data. It means that as a developer, we treat the most essential view of our website as our baseline, and we code upwards from there. As a mobile first developer, it's our job to make the site load quickly for everyone. So obviously, these two contexts are closely related to each other. The only reason I even bothered to try and draw a distinction between the two is because now I want to talk about how mobile first can be applied to our travel website. because you might have noticed that the designer on our team did not send us a design file for how the site should look on a smaller mobile device. I set the course up like this on purpose, because in the real world, a fair amount of the projects you work on will not include a design comp for the mobile view. And I see way too many developers using this as an excuse. Too many developers think in terms of all or nothing. They think, oh, well, the information architect on my team or the graphic designer on my team did not provide me with a mobile-first design view, so I'm just going to develop this website as if it was the year 2009. I don't like that. I don't think it's a valid excuse, and I don't think that's fully embracing our job as a developer. In my opinion, even if you were only given a desktop design comp, there is no reason to not make every website you develop a mobile-first website. So even though we aren't working in absolutely ideal conditions, we are not going to let anything get in the way of building a website that loads insanely fast on all devices. So where do we begin? When it comes to mobile-first best practices, there are things we can do in each of the big three languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We are going to begin with CSS. So right now, let's cut the intro and learn how to write CSS from a mobile-first perspective. Alright, so like always, let's begin by jumping into the command line, and let's make sure that our Webpack task is up and running. So we're just going to run npm run dev. Once that's running, that will allow us to view our website in the browser by visiting localhost:3000. Now, earlier in the course, when we wrote the CSS for this large hero block, we were previewing things in our browser from a desktop or laptop perspective. But if I begin to make my browser window smaller to resemble the form factor of a smartphone, I think it becomes immediately clear that the large hero text is too large for a smartphone. So let's adjust our CSS to fix that. So in our text editor, within the app folder, and then the assets folder, styles, and modules folder, let's open up the large hero CSS file. Let's address the top main title first. So this element. So here is the rule for that element. So we might be tempted to leave this font size declaration in place and write a new media query that targets smaller screens. But remember, in the mobile-first philosophy, we want to treat the mobile view as our baseline and modify things from there as necessary. So to approach this from a mobile-first perspective, let's go ahead and cut this line into our clipboard and say that the baseline style for this element should have a font size of 1.1 rem, and we can modify things from here for larger screens. So we can use a media query, say media, if a screen is larger than 530 pixels, then what do we want to do? We can just paste in the line that we copied to our clipboard a moment ago. Let's go ahead and save this file. And if we jump to the browser, we see that this element now uses the baseline font size of 1.1 rem. And only when I make my web browser larger does it receive the media query style. Perfect. Now before we go ahead and adjust the font size of this element and this element, I want to show you a quick post-CSS tip that will make working with media queries much easier. I want us to leverage the power of mix-ins. If you've never heard of a mix-in before, that's A-OK. The first thing we want to do is configure our post-CSS setup to support mix-ins. So to do that, let's jump to the command line and install a new package from npm. So in the command line, first we'll need to stop the current instance of Webpack that's running. So press Ctrl+C, and now we can run the following command: npm install, and the name of the package is postcss-mixins. And then at the very end, let's include --save-dev. Go ahead and press enter. Okay, and now to actually leverage that package, we just need to jump into our webpack config.js file. Up towards the top, we created this array named postcss plugins. How about right after postcss import, let's just add a new line, and let's require in, so require parentheses, and its name is quotes, post CSS dash mixins. And be sure to include a comma at the very end of this line. Let's go ahead and save this file. And now we can start Webpack up again. So in the command line, npm run dev. Okay, at this point, let's jump back into our large hero CSS file. And let's create a new mixin that will make working with media queries throughout our entire website much easier. So a mixin is really just a reusable bit of code. So we don't want to store the mixin itself in this large hero block file. Instead, in our app assets styles folder within the base folder, let's create a new file. And let's name this file _mixins.css. Let's create a mixin that passes styles along only to screens that are larger than what we typically consider a smartphone size. So to create a new mixin, we just say @define mixin. And then we can give our mixin a name. Let's name this mixin @small. And now we get to say what the mixin should do. So we just want it to create a media query, and this media query should only select screens that are 530 pixels or larger. This is just a somewhat arbitrary number I'm choosing, but let's go ahead and stick with this so you and I are on the same page. All right, and what should be placed within this media query? Let's just say mixin content. This line of code will make sense once we actually use this mixin. So let's go ahead and save this file. And before we can use this mixin in our large hero block file, we need to open our main style sheet, which lives in our styles folder, and it's named styles.css. Now, right after this variables line, let's create a new line and go ahead and import that mixin file that we just created. So it lives in the base folder and its name is _mixins. All right, so let's save this main file. And now we can access the mixin from any of our files. So here we are in the large hero.css file. Let's delete this media query and try using our mixin instead. So instead of typing @media to begin a media query, we can type @mixin to begin using a mixin. The name of the mixin that we want to use is @small, curly brackets, and then we can just say font size should be 4.8 rem. All right, let's try using our mixin again. So we've adjusted this element. Let's try adjusting this element. So that element is named subtitle. So let's adjust this font size. Let's copy this to our clipboard and say that the baseline font size should only be 1.1 rem. And now instead of having to type out a media query and remember the pixel threshold that we set of 530, all we need to remember is @mixin @small. And then paste in that font size that we had just a moment ago. And there we have it. Now I realize that this mixin name that I chose, @small, might be a bit confusing. Because you might think, aren't the baseline styles intended for small screens? Well, it might help to think of our baseline styles as being called @smallest, or @tiny, or @microscopic, right? We want these styles to be applied to every screen, even if that screen is only 1 pixel wide. These styles are for screens so small, we aren't even going to try to come up with a name for how small the screen is. And only once a screen is at least 530 pixels wide will we consider it small. I think the best way to explain this system would be to just create another mixin really quick. So in our mixin file, let's create another mixin, define mixin, and let's name this one @medium. So this will be almost identical to our first mixin. Let's just copy these lines and paste them in, except @medium will have a min width of 800 pixels. And while we're at it, why don't we create a third mixin? So let's copy these lines, paste them again. The third mixin will be named @large, and it will have a min width of 1200 pixels. Now let's save this file, and let's try using all 3 mixins on this top Your Clarity heading. So in our large hero file, here is the rule for that main title element. Let's say the baseline font size for super tiny screens should be 1.1 rem. Beginning at the size of small, @small, let's try a font size of 2 rem. Beginning at the size of medium, let's go with a font size of 3.2 rem. And beginning with the size of large, so at large screen sizes, let's try a font size of 4.8 rem. So let's save this and check out the browser. So here is the baseline style, and if I make my browser a little bit larger, this is what we consider a, quote, small screen size, and we can see the font gets bumped up a bit. If I make my browser a little bit larger, this is what we consider a, quote, medium screen. The font gets bumped up, and if I make my screen resemble the size that we are considering, quote, large, we see that our 4.8 rem style is being observed. All right, so this is the mobile first CSS pattern that we are going to follow throughout the remainder of the course. We begin with the baseline styles that we want all screens to receive, including super tiny screens, and we modify things for larger and larger screens progressively. And that will bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn about responsive images, which are absolutely vital to the mobile first idea of only sending users the data they actually need. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.